This is Thomas Hobbes' philosophy and introduction. So first, let's talk about just very briefly his life and his works. Thomas Hobbes was born in Malmesbury in 1588. So he was one of the earliest empiricist philosophers of the modern era. He studied in Oxford University, being the center of nominalistic scholasticism during his time. So just like many of the other modern philosophers, Thomas Hobbes was also influenced or studied scholasticism because, of course, they were just coming off from the previous era, which is the medieval. And we know that during the medieval times, scholasticism is the most dominant of the philosophies. He served as a tutor for a noble family, a noble English family, which gave him the chance to travel abroad. In fact, Hobbes would be very, very loyal to the nobility, to the monarchy. He traveled to Florence, where he came in contact with the thought of Galileo. He also went to France, and in France, he met Mersenne, who is a friend of Descartes, who also encouraged him to write his critical observation on Descartes' meditations. So, of course, at the time, Descartes was the most important philosophical figure during their time, and everybody wanted to take Descartes, or to take on Descartes, to discuss on Descartes, or to say something about Cartesian philosophy. In 1637, he returned to England, but a struggle between the parliament and the king broke out, and being loyal to the king, that put Hobbes actually in a very difficult situation. So, as a supporter of the absolute monarchy, he had to, had to leave again, and this time, and he retired to France, lived there for the next 10 years. In 1651, after being granted an amnesty, he returned to England and was reconciled with Cromwell. Cromwell is the head of the parliamentarians at the time. When Charles II, whom he tutored, ascended the throne, the king granted him pension. So this shows how close Hobbes was to the monarchy. Okay? Hobbes died in 1679, having lived beyond the age of 90. One of the philosophers who lived really for a long time, no? Past 90 years old. Now, Hobbes wrote one great philosophical work, which he divided into sections and published at three different times. First is the Jove, on the political and on the social and political organism. This was later revised and published under the title The Leviathan. So it was more popularly known as The Leviathan, but originally it's entitled The Jove. Considered to be, of course, his masterpiece, because when you mention The Leviathan, the name that comes immediately to your mind is Thomas Hobbes. Then the second is The Corpore, on the body. And the third one is The Homine, on man. So these are the three philosophical works of Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes vigorously thought, his vigorous thought made a deep impression in his country and abroad. So, of course, even until now, we still regard his Leviathan as one of the important works of modern philosophy. Now, his general notions. Although considered as an empiricist, Hobbes' system can be considered as an early synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. So he was an earlier version of Kant who tried to synthesize, put together the empirical ideas and the rational ideas. So the first general notion of Hobbes is that all reality is matter and derived from matter. So this is the basis of his materialism and empiricism. All reality is matter and derived from matter. He was influenced by the mechanistic thinkers of the time. Of course, we know that everybody been influenced by these mechanistic thinkers, meaning the scientific thinkers of the time. Galileo, even before Galileo, you have Copernicus and company. So Hobbes believed that all phenomena in the universe, without exception, can be explained in terms of the motions and interactions of material bodies. He did not believe in the soul or in the mind as separate from the body or in any of the other incorporeal or metaphysical entities. He was convinced that human beings, which include their intellect, their minds, were entirely material. Of course, later on, he came to think that even God was a sort of a material being. So he was greatly influenced by the materialistic, mechanistic orientation, thinking of his time. Unlike the rationalist who tried to balance between the belief, the idea of in God, or the idea of God, or the existence of God, and the material world. Hobbes, for his part, he bought on the idea of the materialist and mechanistic thinkers of his time. So the human body is like a machine, like a machine. And that political organization, example, the Commonwealth or the government, it's like an artificial human being determined by some material and mechanical laws. Like machines, human beings, including their thoughts and emotions, operate according to physical laws and chains of cause and effect, action and reaction. So just like in the external world, in the physical world, in the universe, there are always physical laws that determine the course of actions or the course of events in the physical or material world. The same could be said with the human body, because the human body is just like a micro machine. Okay? So as machines, the human beings pursue their own self-interest relentlessly, mechanically avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. This reference of pain and pleasure would be the basis of his ethics, that the moral action is one that tries to avoid pain and pursues pleasure. Okay? So it's a kind of hedonism in that sense. Second, matter is endowed with intrinsic movement. Hobbes extended the mechanical theory of the mechanistic thinkers into two directions, into geometry at one end and into psychology and politics at the other end. Okay? Remember that they thought that the scientists or the mechanical theorists, these mechanistic thinkers, they thought that matter has its own intrinsic movement. If we go back to our discussion on Leibniz, Leibniz was saying that these mechanistic thinkers were wrong because matter in itself does not have any intrinsic movement, does not have this substantial form. But Hobbes ignored the substantial forms and thought that matter has its own intrinsic movement. It has its own intrinsic motion. So while bodies in motion exist independently of our perception of them, it is our mathematical thinking about them that discloses their real properties. We could not understand the definitions of geometry without grasping how motion is involved in the construction of lines, superficies, and circles. So geometry is the science of simple motions, and it paves the way for mechanics, which explains the effects of the motions of one body on another. So body move, or bodies, they move, and they cause the motion other beings on other bodies precisely because they have their own source of intrinsic movement. Of course, this position of materialism, of matter having its intrinsic source of motion, is questioned by the rationalists, specifically by Leibniz, who said they are wrong. Matter cannot have its own intrinsic movement. There must be something that unifies, that makes the matter move. And of course, Leibniz identified that as the substantial form. So there is something spiritual in matter that makes matter move. But of course, the mechanistic thinkers asserts that there is motion in matter itself. Okay, so based on this, Hobbes proposed a materialistic psychology. Okay? For him, life itself requires motion. And he maintained that there are many kinds of motions within a living body. So passions stand between the involuntary vital motion, characteristic of all living things, and in animals, or voluntary action by which animals move their bodies to the world, driven by appetites and aversion. So he identified all the sources of motions, the appetites, the emotions, the passions, to a material source, not to a substantial or formal source like in the case of the soul. So Hobbes links motions caused by the impact of external objects on our sense organs and the reverberations of decaying sense to the imagination. The imagination can in turn be considered the small, almost indiscernible beginning of all animal motion. So the imagination again. So these imaginations, anything that is internal in man, the desires, the appetites, the passions, the imaginations, he tied it up with a material principle or a material source. So even the conatus, of course, conatus would be the will, would be the drive. Hobbes identified that with a material cause or a material source. Now, number three, the intellectual and moral and political life is the object of mathematical calculus. Remember that he connected motion with mathematics, right? And therefore, these different aspects of life, our intellectual, moral, or ethical, and political, are all made up of nothing but combinations of matter in motion, of the material in motion. Okay, so like for example, I mentioned already, pleasure and pain is the cause or as the source of our moral valuation. So it's just a combination of the motion, matter in motion, as expressed through our avoidance of pain and, of course, our want for pleasure. So Hobbes is very much interested in scientific explanation of the world, both in its practice and also in its theory. And in his work, The Leviathan, he tells us something about the differences between scientific and historical knowledge and the divisions between the sciences. And in the second work, in the corpore, on the body, he gives a much fuller treatment of issues in the philosophy of science, issues that Hobbes calls method of science. And method tells us how to investigate things in order to achieve scientia. And by scientia, he means the best knowledge. Okay? So method tells us the best way to attain knowledge, to investigate things so that we attain the best knowledge or scientia. So that's the general tone of the philosophy of Hobbes. So for Hobbes, to know an effect through its cause is to know what the causes are and how they work. So this interpretation of the causality is similar, of course, to other understanding of the principle of causality. We are said to know scientifically some effect when we know what its cause are and in what subject they are, in what subject they introduce the effect, and how they do it. Okay, so this idea of causality is very much the same as the understanding of causality of the rationalists, even of the scholastics. The principle of causality. Okay. Now let's go to his theory of knowledge. Hobbes' theory of knowledge, although follows the tradition of empiricism, is much closer to nominalism. Much closer to nominalism. And we have mentioned that he was influenced by the nominal, scholasticism, but we'll go into that later on. For Hobbes, the whole of human knowledge is contained within the limits of sensation. That makes him really empiricist. It's contained within the limits of sensation. Sensations are due to an external movement which generates an internal reaction in our organism. There is something external, the external source of our sensation, the object of our sensation. And through this external object or movement, there is an internal reaction inside us. So the external movement generates reaction on our part. If you remember our discussion on Descartes explained this in the passions of the soul, how we generate these passions of the body coming from the outside, the external, say the external stimulus coming from the outside, causing internal reaction on our part. Reasoning for Hobbes is computation, or the manipulation of symbols. So the symbols themselves are like names. Okay? So you have a sensation, come up with, say, an idea, and then you put a name to this idea. The name to this idea are like the symbols. They serve as marks to ourselves of our conceptions, signs to others that we had this conception. Okay, so this is quite similar to the notion of the terms in scholastic philosophy. Like you have so from sensation, you come up with your conceptions, with your ideas, and then you put names. Say, for example, you perceive a flower and you call it a rose, and then so rose is a name of a flower. So rose is like a mark, it's like a sign. It's a name. It's a mark, a sign of our conceptions. Our conceptions are caused by external objects, by our sensation. So the sensation is a product of something external and internal. The product of that would be our conceptions. But when we think of conceptions, we have to assign symbols or names to them. So reasoning is like computation. You're just putting together the symbols, okay, to generate. So for example, say a flower is fragrant, or some flowers are fragrant. This rose is a flower, so this rose must be fragrant. So just putting together the names, flowers, fragrant, rose, etc., to come up with some kind of a reasoning. So conceptions in turn are phantasms or mental images, okay, which ultimately derive from sense perception. So if you reverse from sense perception, you have the phantasm or mental images and the conception. And then the conceptions are given names, the symbols. So names allow us to organize our own thoughts and to communicate them to others. They do not designate objects directly. So the name stone is just a sign of a stone, only insofar as that he that hears it collect he that pronounces it thinks of a stone. So the stone will only make sense to those who hear the stone if he identifies this name stone to a particular object. Okay? So they do not designate anything except to be a marker, to be a sign of a particular object. This is kind of nominalism. And you can trace this back, this notion of nominalism, to the nominalist of the medieval period. Uh, If you are familiar with, of course, the problem of the universals, what is a universal? Well, some nominalists think that they are just names, platus vocis, puffs of air. Of course, St. Thomas has a different idea of these universals. They are not just names. We form the concepts in our mind, but they are not just concepts formed by the mind, because there is a particular object, individual objects that particularize them. So a stone is not just a name, because there is an actual object that represents a stone, represents that instances the stone in physical reality. Okay. So concepts are representations of qualities common to several distinct sensations, which in speech are expressed by a common name. So tables, chairs, man, flowers, houses, books. These are just common names that express a certain representation of qualities that are common to them. So if you see something common, for example, well, you see in one particular object, this particular objects may have common qualities like they are red, they are round, they are crunchy, they are juicy, they are sweet, etc., etc. So let's call these combinations, representation of qualities. Let's put a name on it. Call it apple. So apple is just a name that represents all these qualities or physical material qualities. So an important type of name is the universal name, which is the name of many things, severally taken, but not collectively of all together. Cars, houses, see, phones. These are universal names. So the mind operates on the concepts through analysis and synthesis, composing and dividing them into their elements. So Hobbes does not go into the what is really behind the names. So the names are just this representation. So if Locke said, well, these are qualities, there must be something behind those qualities, the substance. For Hobbes, there's nothing behind there, but there is something that would represent them, a common name, a universal name that would represent all these qualities. So the mind can manipulate now these concepts. By adding the concept of animality, for example, to that of rationality, we have the concept of man as a kind of combination of the concept of animality and rationality. By subtracting from the concept of man the concept of rationality, then we have the concept of animal. So this system is just a pure mechanical nominalism. We're just manipulating the names. Okay, just manipulating all these names to come up with our understanding of one particular concept or one particular name. Of course, for the rationalists and for the scholastics, they will say there's something behind the names. There's a substance behind the names. But Hobbes, because he's following this materialistic and nominalistic orientation, he would not think of the substance behind the names. So Hobbes does not deny the value of science, of knowledge of abstract causes. At least in that sense, he's different from David Hume, because uh, David Hume criticized, denied, rejected the idea of substance and the idea or the principle of causality. So for Hobbes, science is attained as soon as we have an analytical knowledge of the elements and a synthetic understanding of the combinations of certain things or realities, of course, based on their names. Scientific knowledge is knowledge of causes, and there we know better the parts of things, and we have a better understanding of the way in which the parts are caused, because they are compounded into a whole. Their interactions must be taken also into account. So compositions or synthesis is what Hobbes calls the process of showing how a whole is compounded from its parts. Okay? Synthesis, just put together all the different parts. Thus, Hobbes believed that he had saved science as an absolute value, even though, of course, such a value is only phenomenal, because it's just thinking of the appearances of things being an operation of the mind and not an objective contact with external reality. So it's just the mind playing with all these concepts, playing with all these symbols. So that's how science works for Hobbes. Now let's go to his metaphysics. Quite strange that we can think of metaphysics of Hobbes, considering that he was more of a nominalist, no? More of a nominalist than an empiricist, okay? Much less of a rationalist. So Hobbes accepts the Cartesian notion of extended material substance. He denies the spiritual of its independent existence. Now, let's say something about this material substance that he accepts. Okay, there is a material substance. This is the physical substance. So what he denies is this spiritual substance. Okay, so matter is a substance. Okay, there's matter. So the physical things that you see, that's the material substance. Okay, the res extensa. So Hobbes does not deny that. What he denies, as we've said, is the substance behind these material things, this spiritual substance. Okay. So matter is not passive, as conceived by Descartes and Malebranche. Matter is endowed with motion, and this motion is from within. So this is the what differentiates Hobbes from Descartes. Because although he accepts the material substance of Descartes said that matter is passive. Okay, it is passive. It does not have. If what is active is the res cogitans, the cogito. But for Hobbes, matter is not passive. It is actually it's active. It's dynamic. It has its own motion from within, as we have already discussed. Thus, for Hobbes, there are two metaphysical elements: matter and motion. And this can be reduced to one dynamic matter. One dynamic matter. The intrinsic motion of matter has given origin to the diversity of the inorganic and organic world. Okay? So there is the organic world composed of matter with motion. Okay? Now, life is therefore a product of matter and motion, and the human soul is a composite of very subtle atoms, meaning subtle atoms in the sense that the human soul is like a material being. So by saying that soul is an atom, he reduces the soul to a matter, a very complex, high to highly organized matter, or highly complex set of atoms. For him, the spiritual substance is a derivative of the material substance. So if he accepts that there is a material substance, it's just it's a derivation of the material substance, meaning the main thing that exists is a material substance. If there is a spiritual substance, it's just a derivation of the material substance. So it does not recognize the material substance as separate and existing on its own. Hobbes does not deny the existence of God, but he is decidedly opposed to any positive revealed religion, including Christianity. I just wonder how he was going to conceive of God, because in some parts he would say that God is also a matter in motion. But I just wonder how he's going to explain this materiality of God, how he would explain this materiality of God. So even the moral life does not exceed the limits of matter in motion. Sensations passing to the heart generate pleasure and hate, or inclinations and repulsion. So this is the two intrinsic movement, the inclination towards pleasure and avoidance of pain. So man naturally tends to pleasure, considered as a form of self-satisfaction, and of course, they are averse to pain. But such a tendency must be rationalized by calculation in order that it may bring greater pleasure. Okay? This is possible only in the state, meaning you can get greater pleasure when men form the civil society, when men form the state. So let's go to politics. The state of nature. So he divides this very much similar to Locke. Of course, he was ahead of Locke in this idea that there are two types of states. The state of nature, that's the primitive state, okay, and the civil society, the civil state, the new state. Okay, so state of nature, that's the primitive, and the civil society. Okay, in the state of nature, that's the state that man lived before the formation of the civil society, okay, of the civil state. So the state of nature is founded on a savage egoistic system, which drove man to secure maximum pleasure without hindrance from a form of justice or mercy towards other men. So in the primitive state, in the state of nature, men are like savages. They're like wolves against fellow wolves. Okay? So in that state of nature, life is brutish. It's brutal. It's difficult. It's a constant struggle. There's constant conflict. Okay? So every man was continually engaged in a war against all other men. A universal warfare, universal evil. Okay? So the civil state then becomes a kind of result or a passage from primitive state, from the state of nature to a social state, or to the civil state. Man soon realizes that he cannot always go against his fellow men or other men just to protect his interests or protect his welfare or even protect his life. So there must be some kind of a passage, a transition from the natural state or the state of nature to the formation of society. And the civil state is formed based on a contract, which we call the social contract, the purpose of which is to procure the greatest possible pleasure a pleasure which could not be attained in the state of nature. Because in the state of nature, man will always be fighting against each other. There will always be pain. There will always be chaos. There will always be, you know, uh, brutality. So they have to organize and they have to agree on something. That's actually the social contract. So with the dawn of reason, man understood that he could not live in eternal warfare, in eternal conflict, and that if he wished to satisfy his instinct of egoism, his desire for pleasure, he must seek peace. Must seek peace. And to attain peace, man must cede his natural rights, his basic rights, in favor of an authority which could ensure this peace and allow the greatest pleasure possible. So he cannot cling on to his natural rights forever. With doing so, everybody will have to cling to his natural rights, and in order to protect those natural rights, you have to fight, you have to struggle with other men. And therefore, for the sake of peace and for the sake of greater pleasure, man must give up those basic rights in favor of authority which could ensure peace and pleasure. So, once man had ceded his rights to this authority, he is now bound to obey this sovereign. Because the authority, this absolute authority, becomes the sovereign authority. So, after the contract that established the state, an authority, a new sovereign came into being. Okay? So, this is the person, the highest authority would be the person of the sovereign. But according to Hobbes, while other people ceded their natural rights, this person, this sovereign, this authority does not need to cede his natural rights. So he maintains his natural rights. The sovereign maintains his natural rights. So the members of the state, by way of the contract, gave up their rights in favor of this sovereign ruler, of the sovereign authority, while the ruler or the sovereign enjoys the same unlimited and absolute power which belong to all men in their primitive condition in the state of nature. Okay? So he has all the power now, but of course he has the obligation to maintain peace and to assure greatest pleasure for all. So the ruler must retain this power if he is to have the authority and the strength to dominate the instincts and the passions of individuals and to ensure the maximum good of all and to, of course, ensure peace. So for Hobbes, this is the justification for absolute monarchy, for the sovereign. He must have all the powers so that he will have the strength to dominate, to control, to subdue the instincts and passions of individuals. So this massing together of individuals dominated by force is the state. And this is symbolized by the monster biblical animal, the Leviathan. So the Leviathan symbolizes the sovereign, the authority. Okay? That's the Leviathan, the sovereign ruler. Of course, the Leviathan in the Bible is, a monster, an enormous animal who is capable of devouring all the other animals. Okay? Because for Hobbes, it's not just to devour the animals, but it's actually to protect the individuals, to ensure peace, and to ensure greater happiness or greatest pleasure. So, of course, we know that he named this work the Leviathan. Now, oh, just to say something about this Leviathan, some writers would say that the Leviathan is a kind of apology. It's a kind of this notion of Hobbes about the absolute, the sovereign, no? Is a kind of justification of the absolute monarchy. Of course, the monarchy that he supports. Okay, he's of course, we know that he's loyal. He's very close to the monarchy, and this theory of the social contract is a way of justifying absolute monarchy, the authority of the absolute monarchy. So he tries to legitimize absolute monarchy through this social contract. Now let's go to his religion. Hobbes, or concept of religion. Hobbes combined ethics, politics, and religion, which for Hobbes cannot be separated from one another. So even the Royal Society was founded by men who believed that science could reveal more of the details of God's creation, and therefore it will enhance the worship of God. Hobbes was one of those who pioneered in the process of distinguishing religious questions from other sorts of questions. And he rigorously excluded theology from philosophy and tried to map the proper domains of faith and knowledge. Of course, there's a difference between theology and religion. Okay, theology is a kind of discourse for this particular God. Okay, like for example, the theology of the Christians. Okay, or the Catholic theology. But religion, of course, also has something to do with God, but not a particular religion, not a particular theology. So that's the thing with Hobbes. He was against this particular theology, but he was never really against religion, because religion is taken as kind of belief in a divine being, okay? Not necessarily following a one particular type of theology or discourse about God. So he outlined the theory of the causes of religion and superstition, and discussed the grounds of religious beliefs. And he conducted an elaborate inquiry into the use of various terms in the scriptures. But because his analysis and theorizing is undertaken with the main motive of showing how religion becomes a possible source of civil discord. So in the Leviathan, his discussion on religious matters was an attempt to defend the true religion, okay, from both Catholicism and the priesthood of all believers. He saw clearly that these doctrines were two of the main obstacles in the way of the absolutism that he advocated. So he has a different conception of religion, which he calls a true religion. That's the end of my presentation on Thomas Hobbes. And if you're going to ask about what is this true religion, it's a kind of natural, it's a religion that is based on our common sense, similar to the religion, the natural religion that Hume and Locke advocated. I mean, meaning we do not have to rely on the scriptures, on revelation, to form our conception of who or what God is. So the true religion for Hobbes is a religion that is based on our human understanding, okay? Based on our natural reason, not based on revelation or a particular kind of theology. Any questions?
Doctor, may
Yes,
I ask?
Father.
Um, if Hobbes posited that matter is mechanical,
Yeah.
then why does he associate sensations with or feelings or emotions with something that is mechanical? Because something that is mechanical will keep just moving between cause and effect, cause and effect. Feelings, emotions don't mean anything. They just come in random progression and go, as it were. Why would that be something that he attaches to the fact that it's already res extensa? Uh, so why do feelings matter then?
Okay. Well, he has a different conception of feelings and emotions, Father. Our notion of emotions, feelings, that it is something that is internal, and anything that is internal for us would mean there's something spirituality in the internal, right? Like for example, we have the body, is it is external, and our feelings and our emotions, even our senses, our perception would be internal. And to a certain degree, because it is internal, it would be spiritual, right? So that's our dichotomy. Hobbes blurs this dichotomy. He blurs this dichotomy and said that even those internal things, they are material. Material in this, so material here for Hobbes is not just something that is physical. Okay, we may not be able to observe, for example, the effect of certain things in our, like for example, in our emotion. Like for example, we see or we experience something horrible, and there is an effect on us. We become nervous. We become afraid. I would say that that fear is something internal, something that is emotional. But for Hobbes, he would consider that that fear, that reaction is still a material reaction. So he blurs, for us, there is a distinction between the internal and the external. There is a distinction between the bodily and the emotional. But for Hobbes, even the emotional is interpreted as something that is material. And it's not just Hobbes who interpret things this way. Because if you move forward to the history of philosophy, there are many other philosophers who think similarly. If you were back, Marx, these are materialists. And they reduce everything, including internal phenomena, to materialism. They have different, they have their own interpretations or explanations how this, what we consider to be spiritual, can be considered as something that is material. Other questions?
Hello, Doc. Good morning po.
Yes, go ahead.
Uh, it seems that the Leviathan triumphed as the representation of all organisms that man had ever constructed as a civil society. Suppose that he has all the powers and proper disposition which are derived from the contract made by the civil society, then there would be no limit to his power and control. So does it justify totalitarian?
This idea of the Leviathan is actually it's a justification for absolutism, meaning for, and one form of absolutism would be, it's similar to totalitarianism, right? Absolutism is totalitarianism. But Hobbes was not arguing from, or was not considering, maybe, no, I'm speculating here, that he's not considering the abuses. Okay, for him, the monarchy will always be for the good. the monarchy will always work for peace. The monarchy will always work for the greatest pleasure or the greatest happiness of the subjects. But of course, we know now that that's not always the case. An absolute authority, a totalitarian authority, may actually be abusive. Common sense will tell us. I'm not very familiar with Hobbes in this aspect, but we have Locke to follow in this sense, because Locke is very clear that this sovereign does not really rest on the authority. That's the difference between Locke and Hobbes. Because for Locke, the sovereign will remains with the people. And when this government, which for Locke is just a representative of the will of the people, becomes abusive, then by all means, people have the right to replace that. But we don't find that in Hobbes, because his idea is absolute monarchy. So the question now is, when the monarchy becomes abusive, what do we do? But for Hobbes, the monarchy will always be working for peace. It will always be working for the pleasure of the subjects. But we know that that's not always the case. The totalitarian regime, at the beginning, we also say, well, we are working for the good of all, and then eventually it becomes abusive, violating the rights. That's why there is a counter discourse kind of sovereignty. The counter discourse is the position of John Locke.